A 16-year-old boy headed towards Detroit in 1879 after leaving his father's farm. Trains or horse carriages were the main modes of transportation available at the time, and the earliest cars were mostly thought of as expensive race vehicles for the wealthy. Later on, this young man would create a car business that would transform the automobile industry into what it is today. When Henry Ford arrived in Detroit 35 years later, half of all automobiles on the planet had his name, and he went on to become one of the richest people in American history. That tale is this one. In what is now Dearborn, Michigan, Henry Ford was conceived on his father's farm on July 30th, 1863. Everyone in the family lived and worked on the farm that William Ford, his father, owned. Henry was supposed to take over the family business because he was the oldest of 6 children. He was never interested in his father's business nevertheless. He was the complete opposite of his father. Farming back then required a lot of work and was labor-intensive. Henry tried his best to assist on the farm, but he hated the very thought of it. "I never had any particular love for the farm," as Henry Ford put it. "It was the mother on the farm I loved." Henry, like the majority of youngsters his age, disliked going to school and never completed 8th grade. He preferred to learn on his own schedule, and he developed a strong interest in mechanics at a young age. He studied every piece of machinery he came across because of his fascination with machines. He received a pocket watch from his father when he was 12 years old, and after fiddling with its mechanisms, he quickly learned how to disassemble and reassemble it, as well as the timepieces of his friends and family. He then developed a reputation as a watch repairman and started repairing watches for locals. When Henry turned 13 and went on a field trip with his class to one of Detroit's businesses, he saw a steam engine for the first time in his life. And that is when his love of mechanics developed into an obsession. It evolved into his new pastime over the following few years. When he was 15 years old, he built his first steam engine. But when Henry's mother, Mary Ford, suddenly felt ill, his world changed. Henry was the only person on the farm who was close to his mother, with whom he had a tight relationship. Henry's hatred for the farm grew as he was devastated by her passing. The property carried too many memories of his cherished mother, so he started seeking a way out of his predicament. Henry left the village in pursuit of a fresh course in life after turning 16 and against the advice of his father. Due in large part to the steam engine, Detroit was growing fast as an industrial center at the time, and the city was in desperate need of young engineers looking for employment. Henry would dive into a complete self-reinvention by mastering all there was to know about machines right here in Detroit. He accepted a position with the Michigan car company Works, a manufacturer of streetcars. Sadly, Henry was let go after just 6 days of employment. The James Flower and Brothers machine shop hired him as an apprentice after he had been out of work for some time, paying him $2.60 per week. However, it was insufficient to pay his rent, so Henry made excellent use of his boyhood fascination. To make ends meet, Henry worked a lot of jobs, but whenever he had free time, he would study and play with machinery. Henry Ford chose to move back to Michigan in 1882 when he became 19 years old. He still didn't like farming, so he didn't do much work there, and instead spent much of his time tinkering and having fun with the tools he found there. Fortunately, his father had invested in a portable steam engine, which had quickly spread throughout farmers. At his father's farm, Henry spent the most of his time operating this machine and grew so proficient with it that a neighbor hired him to run his steam engine for $3. As a result, Michigan saw the spread of Ford's mechanical aptitude and gift. When the district representative of the Schenectady, New York-based Westinghouse engine firm learned of Henry's aptitude, the firm employed him. It was Henry's responsibility to set up and maintain Westinghouse steam tractor engines while traveling around southern Michigan. Henry first encountered Clara Jane Bryant in 1885 at a New Year's Eve gathering. They became engaged the following year. Henry's father gave him 40 acres of property as a wedding present, but Henry had other plans for it that didn't involve farming. Henry and Clara emigrated to Detroit in 1891 and settled into a modest flat. Henry heard about the petrol engine at this time after stumbling across a British magazine. A German engineer named Nicholas Otto created a gas engine that was quite unique and far more effective than steam engines. It was only built in small quantities. The engine completed all necessary internal combustion, so they didn't require 30 minutes to start up, for one thing. Few Americans had heard of this new engine, despite the fact that it was quickly gaining popularity in Europe. He fortunately discovered someone who possessed one in the city. Although Henry fell in love with the gas engine right away, he was unable to comprehend how it operated, and the fact that the gas engine was ignited by an electric spark further muddled matters. Henry submitted an application to work as a night engineer with the Edison Illuminating Company at a salary of $40 per month, because he knew he needed to learn more about this. The enterprise, which used a steam engine to produce power for 1,000 residences in the city, was at the time Detroit's largest electric company. Henry was more than qualified to work there as a result of this. His main responsibility was to repair the engine whenever it malfunctioned or broke. But he didn't have much to do when everything was running smoothly. Henry had more than enough time to devote to learning everything he could about electricity and how it operated. Edsel Bryant Ford was Henry and Clara's first and only child, born in 1893. Only 3 months after his birth, Henry was given the opportunity to advance to the post of chief engineer, earning $100 a week. Henry achieved his first functional gas engine in the same year, which was the first step towards realizing his vision of a carriage without horses. He didn't finish his experimental car with a petrol engine until precisely 1:30 a.m. on June 4, 1896. He referred to it as the quadricycle. In essence, the quadricycle was a rudimentary device made of 2 bicycles parked side by side and propelled by a petrol engine. Despite being effective, the project had a few problems of its own. This test vehicle featured 2 gears, but none of them could be used to move forward or backward. The car's lack of a cooling system, which made it prone to overheating after some time on the road, was the major issue. The addition of a cooling system to the car was the most noticeable modification Henry made to it. He then sold the car for $200 and utilized the proceeds to fund a significant future endeavor. Henry started work on his second experimental car with the assistance of the mayor of Detroit, finishing it by July 1899. The new car was bigger, stronger, and more substantial than the old one. William Murphy, a successful timber merchant, joined Henry one morning for a test drive in his brand new car. After the test drive, William was ready to join Henry in his business endeavor. They shook hands shortly after that, and the Detroit Automobile Company was founded on August 5, 1899. Unfortunately, the company failed a year later for a variety of reasons. Stakeholders, who were pressuring Henry to produce passenger automobiles, did not share Henry's thoughts on how to improve the car he was working on. Another factor was that numerous businesses produced the majority of the components needed to build his automobiles. As a result, anytime a delivery was delayed, the entire factory had to wait, which severely decreased production. Only 20 of his first vehicles, which he dubbed the delivery wagon, were made in the first 2 years of his company's existence, taking 6 months to complete. All of this led to Henry's termination from his post, but despite the fact that his first business had failed, he maintained his optimism. Henry once remarked, "Failure is simply the opportunity to start over, this time more intelligently." Since he was released from the restrictions of the Detroit Automobile Company and could now follow his idea in a fresh way, Henry was genuinely relieved when he was fired. Since the pressure was off and he could now concentrate on other things, Henry made the decision to concentrate on racing automobiles. The explanation was straightforward. Henry wanted a platform to display his high-quality vehicles in a sport that had become quite popular in the United States: racing cars. Aside from that, despite his extensive network of well-known acquaintances in the city, few of them would be open to funding his ventures in light of what transpired with the Detroit Automobile Company. The following year, Grosse Pointe, the top national racer in the country, and the vehicle of Alexander Winton was trounced by Ford's freshly developed racing automobile. Henry's 26 horsepower car became the buzz of the town, and this level of acceptance gave financiers the assurance they required to support Henry a second time. The Ford Motor Company was established as a result, with Henry serving as the company's principal engineer. Henry's position soon after was once again questioned. The cause was Henry's persistence in building race vehicles, which enraged his financiers. Another Henry, Henry Martin Leland, was called in to carry out their orders because they wanted him to design passenger automobiles that they could sell to the general public. Ford departed the company because he was displeased that another person had been hired to take his place. According to a quotation from Henry's memoirs, "I resigned, determined to never again put myself under orders." In contrast, Henry Leland carried out the demands of his investors and went on to develop what is known as Cadillac. Ford Motor Company became Cadillac Motor Company after Henry Ford's resignation, changing the previous name of the business. In 1902, Henry and Tom Cooper, a former cyclist who had competed in races, kept making racing automobiles and produced the Ford 999, which had 80 horsepower and was driven by Barney Oldfield, a former bicycle racer who had never driven a car before. As a result, Winton's car was once more surpassed, with a top speed of 91.4 miles per hour by 1904. Henry's new automobile shattered all previous American records. Henry had proven himself to be the best racing car designer in America with these accomplishments and victories. When he was ready to launch his third company, he was confident that with his reputation, investors would support him once more. Henry's third company was founded with the help and financial assistance of 11 investors, including a coal dealer from Detroit named Alexander Young Malcolmson. Ford and Malcolmson Limited was the original name of the business before being changed to Ford Motor Company in 1902. He was resolved not to make the same mistakes he had made in his first two efforts. Ford focused on developing a car that the average person could afford. At the time, owning a car was a luxury that only the wealthy could enjoy. The explanation is that the vast majority of the automobiles produced were made exclusively for racing, and these vehicles were made by exceptionally talented engineers. At the start of his new company, Henry made a statement to his associates and investors. "I will build a motor car for the great multitude constructed of the best materials by the best men to be hired, after the simplest designs that modern engineering can devise." Henry Ford had a knack for identifying and attracting the brightest talents in the business. He hired many impressive young men who shared and believed in his vision. As for the design of the car, Henry made over 20 of them before he got one that finally worked. He called it the Model A. For the next 5 years, Henry kept improving the Model A, which was followed by the Model N. However, in those 5 years, what really changed wasn't just the improvements of his designs, but also how they were being made. One of the lessons Henry took away from his failed ventures was the value of working with a single manufacturer to provide the majority of the components he needed to construct his cars. In order to do that, he located a machine shop in Detroit. Henry had a brilliant idea after seeing the assembly line concept in action at a slaughterhouse while visiting Chicago. He could produce more automobiles in a day if he applied the same concept to the way he built them. You see, production was sluggish at the time because Ford and many other automakers pieced each automobile together one at a time. Henry raised more money in 1904 and erected his own factory. In his new plant, where he had more than 300 employees, he started experimenting with the assembly line. It wasn't until 1906 that the Model N production would actually use the assembly line for the first time. The assembly line, however, was still a work in progress even at the time. However, It did 5 times the production rate, and his new model became the most popular vehicle in the US. Nevertheless, Henry had higher goals in mind. In order to start producing his own engines, transmissions, and other components for the production of his cars, Henry established his own manufacturing business in 1905. Around this time, Henry also made the discovery of vanadium steel, which was largely responsible for launching a new age in the automobile industry. The new steel, vanadium steel, was considerably lighter and nearly 3 times as strong as the old steel. Henry used this new steel to create his new design, the Model T, which went on to become one of the most popular automobiles in history. Henry thought a company should be entirely focused on providing excellent customer service, with the sole exception that earnings should not be uncomfortably high. The Model T was the realization of his aspiration to provide cars for the average person in daily use, with a price set at $150, about $21,000 today. The Model T was initially one of Henry's most expensive vehicles, but it quickly gained popularity in the US. That 15,000 orders were submitted within days of its debut, and the Ford Motor Company quickly rose to the top position among the best automakers in the country. Henry came to the realization that he required a larger plan to build more than 100 Model Ts per day. He consequently constructed a new plant in Highland Park, Michigan in 1910. By 1913, the assembly line was in full operation after a number of tests. Instead of the workers having to move about and inside the vehicle, the job could now be brought to them. The car was gradually built up as it was moved along the queue. The new method cut the production time in half, from 12 hours to 90 minutes. Their production pace of over 300,000 vehicles in 1914 exceeded that of all other automakers put together. Between 1910 and 1916, the number of Model Ts being produced moved from 20,000 to almost 1,000,000. Ford accounted for roughly half of all the cars on Earth at that time. Another excellent strategy from Henry would set him apart in the automobile industry. He lowered the price of the car as the production of Model Ts increased every year. In fact, by 1916, the Model T's price had dropped from its previous $850 asking price to under $400. Even though Henry invented the assembly line and helped usher in the age of the automobiles in America, many of his employees weren't pleased with this advancement. The talented craftsmen among them thought that their new job was disrespectful because they were only given 2 responsibilities rather than having to create a whole car, and they found performing the same thing again monotonous. Employees started leaving Ford to work for other businesses as a result. In response, Henry increased the workers' pay, bringing it to $5 per day. Many businesses chuckled at this action since they thought the business would soon go out of business, but it made the opposite impact. In search of higher pay, mechanics from all across the nation flew to Detroit. Henry Ford said, "We believe in making 25,000 people who are prosperous and content, rather than following the plan of making a few slave drivers in our multimillionaire establishments." The mechanics who were now employed by Henry Ford saw not just a gain in pay, but also a reduction in the number of hours they had put in. Ford was able to add a 3rd shift and run a 24-hour business thanks to the shift adjustment. Soon enough, many other automakers were forced to follow suit out of concern that Ford would poach their employees. In the USA, Henry had changed the way of manufacturing. There is just one rule for an industrialist, and that is to make the best quality goods possible, the lowest cost possible, paying the highest wages possible. Henry Ford. Henry Ford made the decision to buy out the company's other stockholders in 1919 because he had become tired of their involvement. The outcome made a number of people in Detroit billionaires, but it also made Henry Ford the single owner of the biggest automaker in the entire globe. Later, Henry appointed his 26-year-old son, Edsel Ford, as the company's president, although Henry actually held the reins of power. However, even the wealthiest man in America could not ignore the cost of having complete control over the business. Henry persisted in his opinion that the Model T was the preferred vehicle. He paid no attention to the rising demand for more expensive yet luxurious cars like Chevrolet. Being the obstinate and rigid-necked man that he was, he disregarded the advice of other Ford officials and even his own son, Edsel, who suggested that a new model be introduced. Henry finally decided to shut down the Model T assembly line and start constructing an entirely new car in the late 1920s, after he could no longer ignore the decreasing sales figures. When the new Model A was introduced in 1927, it was no longer made in Highland Park, but rather at a larger facility in Michigan along the Rogue River. Henry set out to incorporate all stages of the production process into his new plant. From the refinement of raw materials to the final assembly of the automobile, he succeeded in doing so. Steel, glass, tires, and other materials that went into creating the cars were produced there, making it the biggest factory in the entire globe. Ford's one-man rule over decision-making, though, was no longer the secret to success. In the US market by 1936, Ford Motor Company had slipped to third place, trailing behind General Motors and the Chrysler Corporation. It wasn't enough, even with Henry's most cutting-edge V8 engine design. As the Great Depression grew, Ford was compelled to lay off employees and decrease his rates as the situation only became worse. Henry I, his son, passed away in 1943 from stomach cancer. Henry Ford had remained in charge of the business for 2 more years before giving the business to his grandson, Henry II. After retiring to his farm, Henry Ford passed away on April 7, 1947 from a cerebral hemorrhage. Life is a series of experiences, each one of which makes us bigger, even though sometimes it is hard to realize this. For the world was built to develop character, and we must learn that the setbacks and griefs which we endure help us in our march onward. Ford Motor Company is one of the largest automobile manufacturers in the world today, with a market valuation of over $70 billion. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to like the video and subscribe if you enjoyed it. For now, until the next one, take care.